Readers of African history are familiar with claims that such and such mountain, lake, or river was discovered, in quotes, by certain explorers, usually from Europe. This was the claim to fame for many Europeans, such as H.M. Stanley, although mostly remembered as an American, Joseph Thomson, Mango Park, John Speke, David Livingstone, and many more. This brings up several interesting questions. For example, how truly unexplored was the interior of Africa prior to the entry of these Europeans to the continent? Also, is it possible that the African people living in the interior of Africa were themselves uninterested in geographical exploration in all the meanings of that word? The question of exploration of Africa seems absurd to most Africans whose ancestors obviously knew of the physical geography around them. After all, these people fished and drew water from the lakes and rivers around them, and so they must have known about their presence and location. The same goes for the mountains. Usually, quite often, these mountains had huge cultural significance to them. The counter-argument made is that the knowledge of these mountains, rivers, and lakes was not known much further beyond the immediate areas. And so, the argument goes, it is the European explorers who should get credit for documenting and informing the outside world about these geographical features. This video is a response to that argument, and we seek to show that even under that definition of the word discovery, the claims of most of these explorers were incorrect. We shall go even further and show that Africans not only did exploration, but in their own way, they also collated the information and shared that information widely. In this discussion, we shall look at three examples of discoveries: the supposed discoveries of Lake Tanganyika, Lake Victoria, and Lake Turkana, all in East and Central Africa, which were supposed to have taken place between 1858 and 1888. Lake Tanganyika is supposed to have been discovered by John Speke and Richard Burton in the year 1858 during their quest to search for the sources of the River Nile. To this day, there are publications which still make the claim, such as this webpage here, that's dedicated to Richard Burton, which states that his expedition, in quotes, in 1858 discovered Lake Tanganyika, close quotes. John Speke alone is supposed to have discovered Lake Victoria on June 30th, 1858, and he later undertook a second expedition to confirm this discovery, after disputes with Richard Burton, his European colleague. Regarding Lake Turkana, this was claimed by the Samuel Teleki expedition of 1887 to 1889. His colleague, who was also from Austria-Hungary, wrote a book in 1894, which you see here, and the very title of the book makes clear the claim that the two discovered Lake Turkana. In this 1938 edition of the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society, the explorer Vivian Fuchs also states that Lake Turkana was discovered by the Teleki expedition. So, we now have claimants for the discovery of the three lakes as follows: Lake Tanganyika in 1858 by Richard Burton and John Speke, Lake Victoria in 1858 by John Speke, Lake Turkana in 1888 by the Samuel Teleki expedition. Let us now look at the evidence that these bodies of water were not only well known outside of Africa prior to these years that we gave up there, their approximate locations and local names were well known and published in Europe. This is the central thesis of this video. Before going into the evidence that these features were indeed known, it is worth pointing out that these explorers quite often had pretty good information about these geographical features before they left Europe, which alone tells us that their presence and location were well known outside of East Africa. For example, Teleki heard of Lake Turkana while all the way back home in Austria-Hungary, or what was then Austria-Hungary. So why would the lake be discovered by him in the late 1880s? At best, what most of these explorers did was to place these lakes in a more precise longitude and latitude and shape. Nothing more. Another interesting fact worth noting is the huge reliance these explorers had on Africans for guides and other assistance, and this is another separate topic all by itself. To my knowledge, there is only one book, this one here that we can see from Donald Simpson, discussing this particular topic of African contribution to these exploration expeditions. With extremely few exceptions, these explorers viewed their African assistance in simplistic ways, with positive portrayals only found in backhanded comments. For example, when H.M. Stanley published his 1878 book, in the preface he acknowledges and goes into length thanking many different people and many organizations by name. But there is not a single word acknowledging assistance from any African in the whole preface. As we shall see, these guides had the interior geography all figured out, and they shared this information widely to anyone who wanted to know. More on that later. Number 1. In the year 1873, a Baptist missionary called Reverend Charles New published a book on his time and work in East Africa. In this book, he references long-distance traders who he met at Taveta, what is now Kenya, around the years 1867 to 69, who provided him with a lot of information regarding the human and physical geography of the interior. This information included the widespread usage of the Swahili language about Lake Baringo, Lake Naivasha, and Lake Nakuru, all inside what is now Kenya. In addition, he also made notes of the cultural lay of the land in the entire region between Lake Victoria and the area east of Lake Victoria. In an 1870 issue of the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society of London, there is another article and an accompanying map from another Christian missionary in East Africa, which shows interior trading routes in East Africa. Though the publication is from the year 1870, when this was published, we learn from the map that the information it contains was gathered between the years 1865 to 1867 by the Reverend Thomas Wakefield during his time at Mombasa, in what is now Kenya, and that the information was mainly from 2 traders. The publication is astounding in the sheer amount of information and detail it contains, especially considering that it reflected precise knowledge about areas several hundred miles deep into the interior. And most importantly, it was all gathered by the missionary from the coast. So the missionary was at the coast, and he was hearing and gathering all this information about the interior. The publication shows the detailed routes far into the interior. And as you can see here, we see various villages and centers in between the route and the approximate distances between them. Every single 2 adjacent centers, it shows you the distance between them. This article has references to Nanyuki, Nairobi, and most of the tribes in the interior of Kenya as far north as Turkana. In addition, there are some descriptions of some of the tribes and a linguistics table showing the translations of a few words between different African languages and dialects. The accompanying map shows the trade routes described in the text and also some of the major geographical features. These include Lakes Baringo, Lake Naivasha, and what is clearly Lake Turkana. The shape of the lake and the approximate location relevant to the rest of the features in the map is correct. So the question is this: if this information was published in the year 1870 and it shows Lake Turkana, why would the lake now have been discovered in the year 1888, a full 18 years after this was published in Europe? The same thing applies for much of the work by Joseph Thomson. Before he embarked on his expedition through Maasai Land in 1883, there was a lot of this information that he's supposed to have discovered was already published in Europe. But that is not all. We have barely scratched the surface, as we shall see. Evidence number 2. As if the information we just shared is not enough regarding the precise knowledge of East African lakes in Europe, there is more, and we shall go further back in history. For example, in the year 1855, there was a map from a missionary called Jacob Earhart. This map showed a big lake that we see here in East Africa, which was obviously a conflation or confusion or combination of Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika as one large body of water. The conflation of these lakes was entirely in the mind of the author of the sketch map, Jacob Earhart himself, because one of his associates, called Dr. Kraft, also a fellow missionary at the coast, knew that there were not only 2 separate lakes, but there was also a bigger lake much further north, which he knew as Lake Zamburu, and which we now know as Lake Turkana. There are many publications bearing this out, and let us take a look at just one of them. So what we are going to show here is that Dr. Kraft, the fellow missionary in East Africa, knew that there were multiple lakes in East Africa, and it was not just one huge lake at the center. In one 1852 edition of the Church Missionary Intelligencer, a publication of the missionary arm of the Anglican Church, the publication states that while there are some in Europe who held on to the belief that there was one single lake in East Africa, in quotes, Dr. Kraft had expressed an opinion on this disputed point and stated the conviction of his own mind that the natives clearly distinguished between Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika, close quotes. Obviously, the names used in this document are different from the names that we use today for the 2 lakes. Jacob had spent the year 1854 in Tanga, in what is now Tanzania, from where he made deliberate efforts to learn the interior of East African geography. Without he himself entering any further into the interior, Jacob made inquiries from long-distance traders who were very knowledgeable. He also received similar information from his colleague called Dr. Kraft prior to Dr. Kraft's departure from East Africa in 1853. Jacob's map, the one that we have seen, was published in the German language in the year 1855, and this became very quickly the subject of much debate in November 1855 at the Royal Geographical Society in London. Before the end of 1856, this map and the related information had been published at least 4 times that we know of. The first time was in the German language in October 1855. Then it was published in the Athenaeum, then in the Proceedings of the Royal Geographical Society, and lastly by the Church Missionary Intelligencer, also all of them in the year 1855. Jacob Earhart was intrigued by all this information he was hearing about lakes and mountains and other features in the interior, and he applied for funding from the Royal Geographical Society in order to go see them by himself. This application was turned down in favor of a competing one from Richard Burton. Richard Burton would then go out and he was supposed to discover Lake Tanganyika. But as we have seen, the lake was already known in Europe. One of the people that knew about it was the missionary Dr. Kraft. This was known and published in Europe. The CMS missionaries in East Africa, CMS standing for Church Missionary Society, the missionary arm of the Anglican Church, they were in the habit of sending reports and sections of their diaries back home very frequently. And these publications make interesting reading. For example, here is an 1855 article which describes Jacob Earhart's travels to Tanga and how he came up with the information regarding the Inland Sea that we now know as Lake Tanganyika. That edition and the subsequent ones would get into discussions about the sea and how it was possibly connected with others in the interior. It is in these reports that Dr. Krapf and one of his other colleagues called Johannes Rebmann told of snow-capped mountains in East Africa. And because of that, the two received endless derision from armchair geographers and other people, the most famous of which was a gentleman called William Cooley. In this 1852 book, here is William Cooley, who is engaging and directing much ridicule at Dr. Krapf's reports of Africa's geography. And Cooley makes direct mention of both lakes Tanganyika and Turkana. Obviously, he uses different names for the two lakes, but it's obvious the lakes that he's referring to. So we can see, by the year 1852, the missionaries had put out tremendous information to ignite debates in Europe on African geography. So by 1852, the missionaries had put out tremendous information to ignite debates in Europe on African geography. And we can see that 5-6 years prior to Richard Burton landing in East Africa, the precise knowledge of Lake Tanganyika was well known. So how could he then have discovered the lake? Evidence number 3. We are now going even much further beyond, before 1850. In the year 1843, when Dr. Krapf left Ethiopia and then entered East Africa, his very first landing was just south of Malindi in what is now Kenya. He was there for a few days between December 28th, 1843 to January 3rd, 1844. And during that week, he wrote in his diary that during the time there, he had come to hear about a people called the Wanyamwezi, and in quotes, in whose territory there is a great lake, close quotes. This information was published as part of his diary in the 1840s by the CMS in their publication called the Church Missionary Intelligencer. So we can see, prior to 1850, Dr. Krapf had sent information about the lake that we now know as Lake Tanganyika, and this was published by the Church Missionary Intelligencer in Europe. In addition to these 3 references to the lakes, there were many other references before 1850. For example, when an enterprising British naval officer called Captain William Owen tried to establish a protectorate in Mombasa, Kenya, in the year 1824, the governor who was assigned there wrote in his diary of information that he was hearing and receiving information from long-distance traders coming from the interior, and he was hearing of large lakes in the interior. In this 1835 letter from that former governor, and the letter is addressed to William Cooley, the same gentleman we discussed earlier. The former governor is discussing trade between the coast and the interior, and he goes into details about the trade items that were coming down to the coast and what was going up into the interior. The letter is in longhand and requires effort to read, but it provides great insight into this topic. It is interesting to note that there was one salient African name in the reports from some of the missionaries we discussed here. That is Dr. Krapf, Jacob Earhart, and their colleague Johannes Rebmann. The African name was someone called Harry, and he was an experienced long-distance trader whose vast knowledge of the interior was relied on by the missionaries in figuring out the geography of East Africa. As a matter of fact, he acted as their guide on many of their journeys up and down the coast and also in the interior. Unfortunately, this gentleman was killed around 1850 during one of his travels. It is plainly obvious when you read the reports and publications from those 3 missionaries that without his input, Harry's input, and that from a number of other Africans, such as Chief Kivoi, who came from what is now Kitui in Kenya. The geographical aspect of their reports from these three missionaries would have looked far different. After his passing, another important person emerged to play a similar role in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. His name was Sadi bin Ahedi. The latter was credited by Joseph Thomson, Mr. Ahedi, Reverend Wakefield, and Charles New for his assistance to them and for the information he provided to them about the interior of East Africa. The experiences from these Africans were vast, and their detailed knowledge of the interior very well organized. Equally important, their readiness to share this information was without bounds. So as we can see from all the three pieces of evidence that we have discussed, one of the consistent themes is that there was a lot of trade coming between the interior and the coast. So people would come down the coast with ivory and a lot of other trading commodities. They would bring them to the coast, and they would take home or take to the interior manufactured items from the coast and from outside East Africa. And Dr. Kraft himself discusses this topic quite well. And there are some interesting insights that he brings up. For example, Dr. Kraft noticed that there was a tremendous amount of ivory that was being brought down from the coast. And he figured out quite easily that there was already a significant reduction in elephants in the region along the coast for that reason. There is also a book from the year maybe 1850 by an American trader who was at the coast, and he saw that based on the amount of ivory that was coming down, if the same rate of killing elephants continued, the elephants would soon become extinct. So the point is this: there was a lot of information coming down to the coastline about the interior. The information about the geography, the people who lived in the interior, was very well known at the coast and even outside of Africa. Another question we brought up at the beginning was this: is it really possible that Africans themselves were without the human instinct for geographical exploration? Would they have been unbothered by curiosity regarding what lay on the other side of a mountain, or where a certain river flowed towards? As a matter of fact, and needless to say, Africans did their own exploration. For example, Dr. Kraft's main informant, who we just discussed a little earlier, called Harry, told him of such a journey he himself, the African, undertook with the intention of crossing the middle of Africa from the East African coast all the way to the Atlantic coast. He said he traveled for 50 days, based on what he told Dr. Kraft, before having to turn back due to illness. However, he says that some of his associates on that same trip did make it across to the Atlantic Ocean. The people around Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya were also curious and aware of the nature of the white stuff on top of the mountains. For example, during the reign of a king called King Rengua from near the Mount Kilimanjaro area, he sent an expedition to find out what the white stuff was. So this is an African chief or king who was sending an expedition and asking his people to go figure out what that was. According to the missionary Johannes Rebmann, writing in the year 1848, this expedition took place prior to 1837, and all but one member of the party, the expedition party, died from prolonged cold exposure during that effort. Another example is what was told to Dr. Kraft while at Kitui in the year 1852. Kitui is in what is now Kenya. And this was told to Dr. Kraft by a certain trader from a place called Embu, also in Kenya. This trader explicitly told Dr. Kraft that the white stuff on Mount Kenya was extreme coldness. So this person knew, even though he himself never went up there, they knew that the white stuff meant coldness, extreme coldness. According to the same informant, from the white staff issued liquid water, which collected in a large lake up in the mountain, and in turn, from this lake issued a major river. So the basic nature and science behind snow and the connection between snow and rivers flowing down the mountain was not entirely unknown to the Africans. In conclusion, we can see that the precise location, the size and the name and shapes of all the large lakes in East Africa was not only well known in the region prior to the entry of these famous explorers. This information had been published outside of East Africa and been the subject of much discussion. By 1852, Dr. Kraft knew precisely that Lakes Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi were 3 separate lakes. He also knew that there was another large lake further north, exactly where Lake Turkana is. The records of these missionaries in return do show that credit needs to be given to those African traders from whom they got the information, and for the organized way it was when it was presented to them. Thank you.